Good evening, everyone. Got to put this mic up for my purposes. I have to lean forward and talk into this mic. Welcome to another lecture in the Center for the Study of Economic Liberties Perspectives on Economic Liberty series. Both tonight's event and Thursday evening's event featuring Magatte Wade are co-sponsored with the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership and jointly sponsored by Great Heart Academies and ASU's School for the Future of Innovation in Society. The Center for the Study of Economic Liberty is a joint endeavor of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership and the W.P. Carey School of Business. You'll find information about Skettle's classes on the table out front, and I will encourage students who find this evening's focus interesting to examine Skettle's range of courses on virtue, leadership, entrepreneurship, constitutionalism, and yes, my own course topic, philosophy, politics, and economics. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the Center's mission to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human flourishing. One of the ways to fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who interrogate our Center's topic by revisiting past debates, evaluate economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good or ill, and consider its relation to other human values and freedoms that we may hold. This evening's talk connects the last two of those topics by addressing excellence, education, entrepreneurship, and human flourishing. And who better to address these topics than two social entrepreneurs who have, in various ways, devoted themselves to excellence, education, entrepreneurship, and human flourishing. Magatte Wade is a serial entrepreneur whose passion and products are grounded in her Senegalese heritage. You may have seen her in the movie Poverty, Inc. or on TEDx. And if you visit her website, you'll find out more about her new brand, Skin is Skin, which she is using to tackle racial discrimination. She's one of the most powerful speakers I've ever had the opportunity to hear, powerful in the dynamic sense, and also a wonderful person who you ought to get to know. Michael Strong, that's not to say Michael isn't either. I was going to add something personal about you too. Michael Strong is an educational entrepreneur who left Harvard to spend a year at St. John's College, devoted to a great books curriculum, and never went back. He has been involved in Socratic education and other forms of alternative education in several states ever since, and wrote the book, The Habit of Thought, From Socratic Seminars to Socratic Practice. I should add, here's the personal note. He's a great hero in my story because he started a PhD in economics at the University of Chicago, studying with Gary Becker, and decided he'd learned enough and packed up and left. That Becker had nothing more to teach him. I think I would agree with him. So he knows that I'm a historian of Chicago economics. So his current passion, Michael's current passion, is the Academy of Thought and Industry, a set of private academies and high-tech centers that create a high accountability, high autonomy learning community focused on personal, academic, and professional excellence. Michael and Magatte are wonderful people to have to talk with us about our topic tonight, and I welcome them to the stage. Let's join in welcoming them.
Well, thank you. Tonight's talk is mostly about education, so it'll mostly be me talking. On Thursday, Magatte is going to be talking on entrepreneurship and prosperity in Africa. It'll be mostly her talking. I might chime in a little bit. But because she's from Senegal, where they have, I would say, an intact virtue culture, may call upon her at some occasions to compare adolescence in the United States with adolescence in Senegal and related topics. You want to say anything about that before I... Okay, so I'll give you the big show and then we'll chime in, Magatte. First, so to give you some background, after spending about 15 years in education, starting various schools and programs, I met John Mackey, co-founder and CEO of Whole Foods, and I'd created a bunch of schools, he'd created a bunch of grocery stores, and we both were do-gooders who believed that entrepreneurs and markets were a more effective way of making the world a better place than was government. And so we created an organization originally called Flow to promote entrepreneurial solutions to world problems. Within that, we soon decided that was too big a tent, So we created Peace Through Commerce as a spin-off that examined the ways in which entrepreneurs and markets can reduce conflict and increase peace. Then we created Accelerating Women Entrepreneurs. Micro-entrepreneurship had been famous, and we thought, hey, if it's good for a developing world woman to be buying chickens and selling eggs, how much better for developing world women to be creating $20 million, $40 million, $100 million companies and thereby create real prosperity in developing countries. And the joke is that we gathered the world's best developing world women entrepreneurs together, and I pursued the best one and married her. So that's the kind of brief background story about Magatte and I. Happily ever after since. And then we also created Conscious Capitalism, which is another spin-off. And John Mackey is still deeply involved in that. Magatte and I are both peripherally involved in that. So kind of going back down a level, first I want to talk about why I see what I'm talking about in terms of creating lots of different virtue cultures, and I'll talk about those in a minute, as really urgent. I personally, so mostly I'm going to talk about adolescence. Some of what I say may apply to elementary, but I'm very biased towards adolescence because I've spent most of my life working at high school or middle schools, creating middle schools and high schools. And I see adolescence in the United States as a catastrophe. And so, hopefully some of you have healthy, happy teens, or if you had a bumpy few years, they're now healthy, happy teens, or if you're not yet to that stage, you'll get them through smoothly and they'll be healthy, happy teens. But I think by normal historical standards, adolescence is not a healthy period in the United States. So I'll give you one metric. Relative to the 1950s, suicide rates among teens are about 3 times what they were in the 50s. You see a lot of media sometimes about, in the rise of social media in the last 10 years, suicide rates are up about 30%. That's horrifying. But they're 3x compared to the 1950s. If we went to a society and said, look, we're going to have your youngest, most powerful, healthy people kill themselves at 3 times the rate they're currently killing themselves, you'd think some people would be freaked out. But no, we just have this situation where incredibly high rates of suicide, certainly not the case in a traditional country like Senegal. And so what's wrong with our kids that they're killing themselves at this rate? It's horrifying. Different kind of metric. About 1/3 of American teens are on prescription medication. And of course, often prescription medication is good and useful and healthy. But 1/3? What's going on when 1/3 of our kids are needing medication? And some of this has to do with anxiety and depression and ADHD and all these sorts of things. Again, in a traditional culture, and because I have spent a lot of time in Senegal with Magatte, they're not needing this kind of medication. So, what's going on that we need to medicate all of our kids? Very different sort of thing. Gallup has done polls of American high school students. There's something called the engagement cliff, where in elementary school, about 70% of American kids are engaged with school. By the time you get to high school, that's about 45%. And so wait, only 45% of our kids are engaged in their high school experience? Something's wrong. A minority of our kids are focused on actually what's going on in the high school experience. They're mostly disengaged, and that doesn't include all the kids that have dropped out, have been incarcerated. 45% of those who are actually in school are disengaged from school. I see that as a catastrophe. And then you connect that with the substance abuse. In addition to the prescription medication, that doesn't count all the students who are self-medicating through drugs and alcohol. And if you listen to pop music, you hear things about kids basically, school is so miserable, I get stoned in order to bear it. And some of us, those of us who are educated, typically we're a self-selected group of the people who found school okay. So when I talk about school being catastrophically bad, most of you guys, I assume, are the survivors. For whatever reason, maybe you've got a genetic anomaly that allows you to put up with American high school. I don't know what it is. But the ones who go on and replicate the system are the ones for whom it worked. Meanwhile, we are leaving massive numbers behind. And I think by historical standards, any sane person who came from outside and looked at adolescents in the United States today would be like, what's going on? I didn't even get into things like cutting, self-harm, eating disorders. When you think of, again, I go back to Senegal, the teens, they are normal and healthy and happy. Like you come here and the kids are all falling apart. What's going on? I know a professor at Stanford who claims 90% of Stanford students are medicated. I have no idea if that's the case. Maybe they all need it. Palo Alto High, huge suicide rate at Palo Alto High. So something is wrong with our teenagers. And going a different direction, the leading cause of disability in the United States today are behavioral disorders, including substance abuse and mental illness, functional mental illness, depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia. So right now, in terms of a public health crisis, and the US is kind of ground zero of all this, so other countries may think, oh, this is a US problem. In most of these trends, just like people are getting fat around the world, US was ground zero of the global obesity epidemic. We're spreading it around, spreading the dysfunction. We're also spreading around this kind of adolescent dysfunction. So these sorts of issues that used to be rare in other countries, kind of a developed world problem. As countries become prosperous, all of these things start to happen, and so our society is falling apart. We in the US are kind of ground zero of this global falling apart kind of thing, and I see the way standard school is structured is a big part of that. So that's kind of my, this is why I think it's a big deal. And so below that, now I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by virtue culture. Virtue culture is not a kind of colloquial word. It's not, maybe you guys, talk all the time about virtue culture, but probably not. It's kind of sort of a weirdo esoteric language. But what I mean is a sense of excellence, that I think adolescents need to be raised with a sense of excellence in a community that values and cares about being a good person somehow. To give you a couple of things. First, I think all traditional cultures until modernity in the last, we can go back, maybe a couple hundred years, but certainly the last 100 years, it's been accelerating, where there's no longer a common sense of excellence. So, the Apache had one kind of virtue culture, the Wolofs in Senegal a different virtue culture, Confucianism in China a different kind of virtue culture. So I'm talking about something that's bigger than any particular, Victorian Britain, a different kind of virtue culture. So rather than have people get attached to, this is the one right virtue culture, I'm at a place where I would rather have teens be raised in some kind of culture where there's some kind of excellence than even care about which one it is. I'm happy to support Jesuit virtue cultures and Mormon virtue cultures and Islamic virtue cultures and objectivist Aristotelian virtue cultures, and I don't care. I think in order to stop this absolute catastrophe in adolescence, I want to have more schools where more kids are more deeply embedded in cultures, subcultures, where there's really a sense of honor and excellence. I'm going to talk now a little bit about places where this is partially working. There was a wonderful book I read a number of years ago by a man named Charles Rivas. He was an education professor. It's called Lessons from Extraordinary Educators. And he looked at places around the country where, this cheerleading team in Kentucky that won the national championships over and over, or this debate team in Texas that was winning state championships over and over. And all these little pockets, and he's like, it's not the water. It's not like you drink water in this Kentucky town, you become a super duper cheerleader. No, there were really great coaches and educators in those towns that were producing consistently superior performance over and over again. And he went around and looked at all these places that were just, knocking the socks off year after year after year. And he found they had a couple things in common. One, there was a real sense of love and respect. The students knew that the coach or teacher or mentor really cared. Second, they had very high standards of excellence. So they believed that these ordinary kids could do amazing things. And then finally, they had the technical expertise to take them to world-class excellence in whatever domain. And I think that's a pretty simple, straightforward recipe. If you set high expectations, but you don't have a relationship of love and respect, then the kid could just feel kind of beat up on. If you are all love and respect and don't set high standards, warm and fuzzy, but we're not getting stuff done. So one of the things I've always tried to do when I hire teachers is teachers that both set high standards and are really good at the love and respect component. But I envision that as a situation that was common in a lot of traditional cultures where the community cared about the teen and the teen knew that they were cared about. Imagine, we evolved in tribes 150 and there was deep sense of caring. And there was honoring. In traditional stories, the young hero that goes out, heroic stories in all cultures, goes out and kills the great woolly mammoth or whatever. Kind of an anecdote that put this in high relief for me. When I was in Alaskan public schools leading Socratic seminars, I'll talk about Socratic seminars in a bit. I remember there was this one kid that I was having a really hard time engaging. He was this really big Native American kid. I was in a 7th grade classroom and he was probably 6'2" already in 7th grade. And he was just closed down and I could not get him to talk, getting everybody else to talk. And finally I just said, Seagram, and his name was Seagram. I said, Seagram, what do you like to talk about? And he said, fighting. And we got him going on fighting. And it turns out that after school every day, he'd go out on the playground and beat the crap out of everybody else, because of course he was much bigger. And meanwhile, during the school day, this was this, ugly classroom with fluorescent lights and this kind of timid older teacher who wanted to retire and was not really into it, was just using detentions to get the kids, kids bad, send them to detention. I thought, in a normal, healthy culture, such as Native American culture was 50 years ago, he would be the pride of the community. This big, strong kid who could, hunt like nothing else, he would be an aspiring young hero. I expect he would be really well behaved in that culture. He would be honored. He would want to be honored. There would be this kind of respect for somebody with that kind of capacity. And instead, he's in this ugly classroom, being taught by somebody, being humiliated almost daily by somebody he didn't really respect. And it was a meaningless, horrible experience, and I hate to think what happened to Seagram. I would imagine he might not be in a very good place right now. But that reminded me that this whole system, what we call schooling, is so unnatural, just dramatically unnatural, that a healthy human being put in that environment who doesn't happen to be predisposed towards the academic disciplines that are validated is basically just humiliated and bored and destroyed, I would say, by this kind of a system. So, not to put too fine a word about it, I want lots of diverse, healthy virtue cultures, and I want to eliminate school as we know it in adolescence. Now, kind of with all that high-level ranting going on, I'm going to dig down a little bit deeper into how I got into such a strange place, because normal people think, oh, let's just get a better curriculum, better teacher training, better assessment, and I'm at a point where no, that's not going to stuff, we can spend X million billion dollars on better curriculum, better teachers, yada, yada, yada. The structure of it, there's something fundamentally wrong with the structure of it. So kind of digging down into how I got there. So my, as Ross said, I went to Harvard, then I went to St. John's, known as a great book school, but for 4 years, all you do is read, think, and talk about ideas. I loved it. I love talking about ideas. It's something I do for fun nonstop. So the selfish version of my career is I couldn't get enough of talking about ideas, so I create schools where I can talk about ideas more. And I enjoy thinking about things. So when I graduated from St. John's, while I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I began under Mortimer Adler's Paideia program to go into public school classrooms under the Paideia program and train teachers to lead Socratic seminars. It's, we read a text together, and we ask questions, and we get the kids thinking and talking about whatever they're reading. My very first one was a hit, luckily. I did a demonstration Socratic seminar with 5th graders in inner city Chicago. They loved it. They were all talking and excited and everything, and it seemed so easy and fun. And so that got me going, where I did this regularly. Later, I got a full-time job in Alaska training teachers to lead Socratic seminars. And over time, I found a lot of inconsistency. It was not always fun and easy, sometimes really hard. Sometimes you ask kids questions, they just stare at you. Sometimes they get in big fights. Sometimes they get off topic all the time. All sorts of different things happened. But as I continued to do this, I developed a larger and larger repertoire of skills for getting kids to engage constructively in intellectual dialogue in all kinds of different classrooms. One of the things that I started doing, though, was we were doing it, the original model in Mortimer Adler was once a week Socratic. We were doing it in Alaska 5 days a week. And one of the things that changed was, instead of thinking, oh, this is a classroom activity, most teachers, oh, what's the lesson today? What's the activity? Instead, when we were doing it every day, I started, when I had a bad day, I'd okay, it's not about this day. It's about, can we have a better one next week? And then eventually it was not next week, it was next month. And then not next month, at the end of the year. So I developed longer and longer time horizons. And I realized what I was really doing was changing the habits of the kids in the classroom. So that normally, in a normal classroom, kids are trained to be passive. Quick detour. John Taylor Gatto, twice named New York State Teacher of the Year, describes conventional education as 13 years of training in how to be passive and how to be dependent. And I think that's exactly right. I think it's, if you wanted to design a system, let's create a population that's passive and dependent, something like our public school system. So, I was flipping that around. I want the kids to think, talk, argue, what do you think? What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why not? And over time, I was getting better results by systematically training their habits. So they'd go into class, and instead of expecting the teacher to talk at them, they would expect to take responsibility for their own learning by digging into the text, by thinking about ideas, by having a respectful conversation. And by means of consistent long-term training, I could get much better results. Concrete thing in Alaska, we were funded by Alaska's Youth Ready for Work. It was a group of private sector employers who represented 25% of the private sector workforce in Alaska. They were financing us because even then, and this is, gosh, almost 30 years ago, it was obvious that the need for soft skills, so-called soft skills, I read a good article that said we should call them essential skills, was really important. They said we need people not so much who can do Algebra 2, but we need people who can look you in the eye and who can speak respectfully and who can understand what you say and respond. Just very basic interaction is like the thing they were most wanting out of the workforce. So I had women from Alaska's Youth Ready for Work, and I actually deliberately selected women because I thought they would be better at perceiving the growth in the soft skills than men might be. May not be fair, but I stacked the deck in my favor. So I had women look at the cohort I had before and after, and they were blown away at how civilized and respectful and thoughtful the kids were after a semester of daily training. And sometimes I say what I do is person A speaks, person B listens and thinks, and then responds. Sounds easy, but how often do you see that in national public figures? It's pretty esoteric. So if we can just get to the point where we can really think and argue intelligently and respectfully together, huge win. So I realized over time that I was not teaching a curriculum, I was training the students in new habits of interaction. That's why my book is called The Habit of Thought. We were reading a section on William James once, a 19th century psychologist. He talks about habits, and I talk to kids, what do you think a habit is? Initially they think a habit is biting your fingernails, because of course the examples of habits they experience are the kind of habits where mom and dad get on their case all the time. But eventually, James talked about intellectual habits and emotional habits, and one of them said, hey, that's what you're doing to us, you're changing our habits. And they realized both change in intellectual habits and change in emotional habits. And so I was able to get lots of diverse cohorts of kids to the point where they could be really focused, thoughtful, and so in dialogue. But in a regular school, I realized one of the problems was that I do a great job of this in third period, and then in fourth period, they'd have a teacher who said, shut up and take notes. And I thought, that's not how you really create change and transformation if you're teaching them one thing on one side and something else on the other side. In addition to that, in the public schools, true anecdote, I was in Soldotna, Alaska, and a mother came up to me and she said, your questions cause confusion. Confusion comes from Satan. Therefore, what you're doing is satanic, and I'm going to get it out of the schools. And it turns out 5, 7, 10, aggressive parents can get anything out of a school. So based on that, that program was destroyed, and so I realized both, if I can't control the teachers and the parents and have everybody aligned, I'm never going to make much progress. So that led me out of the public schools into creating private schools. Later I created a charter school, so I know the charter school world really well. But the great thing about creating my own schools is I get to pick teachers who are all aligned. I get to pick parents and students who are all aligned. In order to create a deep, serious virtue community, I need everybody on the same page. Just look at a couple of different issues on that. So one of the things that's really important to me that should be obvious, but shockingly it isn't, is I want people who take ideas seriously. When we're talking, so last fall in the school in San Francisco I'm leading, we read Plato's Gorgias, where he talks about, is it better to suffer injustice or to do injustice? And that's, I think, a pretty interesting sort of question. Is it better to suffer injustice or do injustice? The kids totally, passionate about it. But I want them not to study Plato as if it's academic material. I don't care what they know about Plato's life. I want them to take seriously, are you going to suffer injustice or are you going to do injustice? So we talked about, suppose your best friend was a hit and run driver and, maybe killed somebody. Do you want to bring your friend to justice, or do you want to let your friend get away with it? This is a very kind of real question for teens just about into the world of driving. So always what we're doing is we're not just talking about school stuff. I want every conversation to be about who are you, what do you stand for, what are you doing in the real world? And so for me, this is where it starts to become more of a virtue culture issue. We certainly want the intellectual virtues of, are you inquiring, are you taking initiative, do you move class alone? Ultimately, I want them to be responsible for it, not me. But also, we're not just learning school stuff. This is who you are and who you want to be and what do you stand for in life. And I would say that makes this learning a lot more real for kids. Because if they just think, oh, teacher wants me to learn this old stuff, blah, 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 they don't care. But I think in a normal, healthy community of any kind, we are talking about moral decisions. We're talking about who we are, what we stand for, what kind of decisions we're going to do. Are we a jerk? If we're a jerk, what should other people do about us? And that got me into this whole kind of realm of not just the school and intellectual virtues, but yeah, I want a community where the staff are willing to take these issues seriously, consistently with students, where the parents welcome our taking this seriously with students. And so we're creating a moral community where we're talking about how we should live our lives every day. And obviously it doesn't come up as much, say, in chemistry class, but it might come up in chemistry class. It doesn't come up as much when we're doing math, but it might come up when we're doing math. So I began to understand my project of creating schools as not one so much as teaching in a traditional sense, but changing the culture. And part of this too is if you change the culture in the right way, you can become really effective at learning. So take something as simple as focus. It turns out there's a wonderful book by a man named Cal Newport called Focus is the New IQ. He makes the case that people that can sustain long, serious focus on hard material are going to do better in life. Whether a software developer, a graphic designer, an accountant, whatever, the ability to be long, serious, and focused. I see focus, long, serious focus when you maybe don't want to do it, when you want to check your phone, when you want to watch a YouTube video, when you want to do something else, the ability to focus, even when it's hard, as a virtue. So I even see ways to perform better in the real world as contingent on these habits and attitudes of who we are, how we delay gratification. A lot of becoming a virtuous person is finding ways to delay gratification, to get something else done, and we're doing it not because somebody told us to, but because we have a changed understanding of who we are and what we want to achieve in this life. So that was kind of a little bit of how I got as an educator from all the apparatus that school usually does to my focus on virtue. Now I want to give you a couple more frames. First, an intellectual frame. So Alistair MacIntyre is a famous 20th century philosopher who he takes Aristotle's notion of virtue, and then he talks about the diverse virtue cultures from various different traditions. He says they share certain common elements. One of the elements is a lifelong conception of a human being. What do you achieve in your life? Another is a moral tradition, that we have some kind of moral tradition we share in common. And then finally, a third are a set of practices, things we engage in together that help cultivate those virtues. Going to the lifelong conception of human well-being, in traditional cultures, what you do is what you stand for, and even who your parents were. If your parents did something bad, everybody in the community knows about it, and you know about it, and it's not easy. How you act day to day is part of you as this whole person and part of your family and part of your whole tradition going on. Whereas if you think about it, most teens today, and I'm going to be disparaging, so if there are any teens in your room, I apologize if you're not one of them, but a lot of teens today, what am I going to do this weekend? And what am I going to do this weekend is not a time horizon that is useful for cultivating virtues. If you want to have the ability to delay gratification, to learn how to focus hard, some students do it in order to get into a college they want, but if you really want to have your life be meaningful, you need to be thinking about your life on a longer time horizon than just what am I going to do this weekend. So that's the lifelong time horizon. One of the things we do at the school in order to get students thinking along these ways, and it's not quickly. Everything I do is drip, 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 drip. Aristotle talked about virtues are what we repeatedly do. So we have the students write an autobiography from the age of 100 every year and have them imagine what their whole life is. And often initially it's really silly. I want to be a rock star, Nobel laureate, and yada, 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 totally cool. But eventually they start to become more reflective and think about, what do I want to do with my life? And we want a culture, again, a subculture, where it becomes normal to think about what I'm going to do with my life, what do I stand for? So that's the lifelong meaning piece. Then in terms of a moral tradition, I think one of the reasons any attachment to virtue fell apart in Western culture is both kind of religion and sexuality. So right now our culture in the United States is so divided. There are some people who have a certain frame where only within a certain religious belief or only with a certain sexual practices or whatever. And that has become so severe, that schism has become so severe, it's hard for us to even talk. So insofar as I'm talking about an intellectual tradition where person A speaks, person B listens, and then replies, that's kind of beyond the culture wars, so hopefully we could all commit to the virtue of civil discourse. But I'm interested in diverse virtue cultures, so there are virtue cultures which have very traditional values. There are also virtue cultures that have very non-traditional values. Again, for me, having the kids embedded in a moral tradition is more important to me than which moral tradition it is. But I think the kids need to have some shared understanding of what counts as morally significant. And the faculty need to have some understanding, some shared understanding of what counts as significant morally. And it's an interesting question about what are the boundaries of that and how tight it needs to be. But into a very specific case that's of interest to me, Utah has the highest rate of social mobility in the United States, and it has the lowest per capita education spending. I'm very much a secular intellectual, but I am blown away by the success of the LDS community in terms of creating, I would say, a successful virtue culture where with very low cost, they're getting absolutely amazing performance. It's one of the top ranked states with respect to education, various education metrics, and they're doing it without much money. But again, I think it's training kids and training communities to be supportive and healthy. I kind of go into a more personal thing. I'm of a generation where in my own family, in my own extended family, I grew up in the 70s, graduated from high school in 79, and we saw the kind of collapse of standard norms in the 60s and 70s and 80s, with drugs and sex becoming a huge thing. And so my mother's a high school dropout, my father was an elevator repairman, and I've known half a dozen Nobel laureates and CEOs and whatnot, so social mobility worked out for me. But I have people in my family who went to prison, were on welfare, had all sorts of difficulties. I had one cousin who killed somebody else who committed a felony theft, certainly a lot of substance abuse. So I've seen the kind of catastrophe. If anybody's read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, the story of Fishtown is the story of my family, that there were people who, the older generation, the grandparents, mostly had good habits, kind of still a healthy culture. Then as the wave of sex drugs kind of wiped out a certain set of people in the 70s and 80s, I saw people's lives destroyed by it. Does that mean I want to go back to the 50s? No, I think this is where I'm pluralist. If some subcultures want to do what they want to do, fine. If others want to do what they want to do, but you need to have a certain strength and robustness, and teens in particular need to have a moral framework and a strength and robustness and support so that they don't crash and burn. I'm happy to have you guys can all disagree with each other and go off and start 200 different virtue culture schools, and may the best ones win. So I think as long as we're fighting over, should we do abstinence education or should we do another kind of sex education in 7th grade, we'll never get this done. That's why for me, we need to go off in all our different directions, have everybody create deep programs with integrity that raise children well, and quit fighting and start raising healthier, happier, more successful children. So that's kind of a high-level piece. One other piece on how I got here, going back to the Gary Becker piece. So I was interested in economics primarily because I thought rational choice was ridiculous. I was a humanist, and I thought, of course, people are not self-interested maximizers. Ideas and culture are important. And so I was working on a framework within a Beckerian framework to show how ideas and culture are important. And it turned out I'd get into shadow prices, and it all became very esoteric. But I think one can show how there is a certain value to being part of Mormon culture. There's certain value to being part of Senegalese culture. Certain kind of cultural norms are likely, no guarantee, but likely to result in better and worse life outcomes. And we don't need to dictate which ones people should have. Again, we should be radically pluralist. But I think as long as we avoid the notion of saying some cultural norms lead to different outcomes, we're not going to help people. And I want to say very specifically that one of the ways in which we can't even talk about this is I'm not saying that we should blame people whose lives fell apart because they got involved in bad stuff. I'm saying we should change society so we can create schools where they are protected against all of this garbage. And that's not an easy project, but for me, I blame those who want a one-size-fits-all government system that does not allow people to choose the virtue community that they want their children to belong to, that doesn't allow people to say, this is what I think will protect my children from the chaos of our culture. Very specifically on the school choice front, I think was a strategic mistake for the school choice advocates to focus on test scores, because I know if a kid is at risk of suicide or at risk of substance abuse or at risk of serious self-harm, the last thing you're worried about is the test scores. You want to get your kid out of this really dangerous community of whatever sort and put them in a healthy community like that. And so I think our culture is such a disaster for teens that I would expect the first wave of school choice, and the first wave being several decades, to be mostly about better communities of well-being and less about academic performance. One of the most outrageous things I read was some critic of school choice saying, look, these parents are not choosing the schools with the best test scores. Clearly, they are not informed parents. And seeing the kids I've known, I thought, what if they're putting their kid in a place where they're no longer in danger of dying? And you're saying you're better informed than them? I have no patience for that. So on to kind of a vision of where I think things should go. I would love to see a market in happiness and well-being. So I often say it's easier in our society to be an entrepreneur selling pornography, drugs, gambling, than it is to be an entrepreneur selling happiness and well-being. I see myself as an education entrepreneur, as somebody who's marketing happiness and well-being. I want to create islands of happiness and well-being for the kids under my care. Not claiming it's perfect, not claiming it's easy, but we're competing against this massively subsidized program that is, in fact, I think, misleading people as to what's important. So it is telling them that this particular curriculum is the important thing, when I would say happiness and well-being and focus and intellectual integrity and curiosity and these sorts of virtues are more important than what that system is telling them is. And that system is often humiliating them and boring them and leading them to become involved in very harmful sorts of things. So I would like to legalize markets in happiness and well-being by means of I'm a member of the separation of school and state, so my ultimate version is let's eliminate all relationship between K-12 schooling and market, and then we entrepreneurs of happiness and well-being can create diverse virtue cultures, and some of them will be spectacular, and some of them won't, and the bad ones will gradually die, and the good ones will gradually improve. I'm a great believer in the principle that in an entrepreneurial market, we always see a higher quality, lower cost, and more niche product differentiation. So I think if we were really allowed to do this, we would see higher quality in terms of markets and happiness and well-being for your children, and lower cost. For me, when I start these things up right now, they're expensive because I have to train everybody. And then finally, more niche diversification. Yeah, we'll have the Catholic Montessori and the Mormon Entrepreneurial School and the, Islamic, math school. I don't care. I want to have lots of different, cultures of happiness and well-being. Now, I'll close with one specific anecdote about a very specific experience. I'll invite Magatte to say something about Senegalese adolescents. So Montessori is a connection. The Academy of Thought and Industry, my present school, is a high autonomy, a high accountability school that is designed to be a high school model for Montessori Elementary, because the parent organization is focused on Montessori as high autonomy and high accountability. So it's not about the specifics of, say, the Pink Tower in Montessori. But at one point I was working in a Montessori middle school where half our students had come up through Montessori and half came into the public school at 7th grade. And for people who don't know, I do think Montessori schools tend to create a subculture, a virtue culture. They talk about it as normalization. They don't talk about it as virtue. But they create a distinctive subculture that's different from the outside world. So at 7th grade, I had these 3 girls come into my school, and they hated it. Their moms had forced them in here. They wanted to go back to the public school with all the cool kids. In 7th grade already, they were kind of, tough and jaded and mean girls and, heavy makeup and attitude and all of this. And they thought their moms would put them in the yuckiest, least cool school ever. But, they quit whining. After a couple of weeks, gradually, the mean girl thing left. They started to be a little bit softer, more open. And after a semester, they were completely enculturated in this new culture, and they didn't seem at all like this mean, tough girl. Then we only went to 8th grade. When they went off to high school again, I remember the girls crying and crying and crying because they knew that they would have to go back out there and put a mask on and pretend like they could not have real relationships. And it was painful to them to realize they had to go back out there and do that. And so for me, that was a small case study of a situation where you create a healthy little community, and actually teens love it. But if they have to go back out there, they know what they have to do in order to survive out there, and it's not something they want. So I want to create more opportunities like that so kids never have to go and be people they don't want to be and get into situations where they have to, in some ways undermine their own well-being in order to survive in the Lord of the Flies situation. Magatte, you want to say, because Senegal is so different, you want to say a little bit about the Senegalese adolescents?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Well, I guess, yes, I'm from Senegal. And so I don't have children. Michael and I, we don't have children together. He's got 2 kids, and by the time I got into his life, they were grown-up children. So I did not get to really enjoy, like seeing how you manage these little people, help them grow, go to the other side. So, but it would never before have occurred to me to even bother about education, because I thought maybe we have it all figured out. You just manage to get into a good school and everything will work out. I was able to go into good schools, both in Germany and France, and then that's pretty much where I was raised, Germany and France. So for me, what do you mean education? So I would never in a million years have ever paid attention to this thing. But then I started, I guess he infected me, because being with someone like Michael, who looks where he looks and who does what he does, you would be quite missing if you all of a sudden don't start to pay attention to what he has been seeing. And I was shocked by what I was seeing. And I think in my case, the issue I also didn't really think about education is because although I grew up in Europe, I think my parents, talking about this virtue culture that he's talking about, I think within a household, we had it very much. I come from this household where my parents are like, when I come home, like, well, Julie gets to do this and that, and like, Julie, and we are us. So, girl, leave that thought at the door, because here, this is what goes on. I was like, okay. So, there is not only that, but I also think that the European culture, what happens in Europe also, is a little bit easier on kids than what is going on in the US. I absolutely had no idea what was going on in the US. And later I had to come and think that maybe this whole thing has to do with prosperity. So insofar as I'm working on prosperity, because remember, the US is far more prosperous than Europe. I lived in Europe. So when you are middle class in Europe, you're still lower class when you move it over to the US. That's how rich this country is. So because I've been working on prosperity in Africa, I'm just thinking to myself, okay, I'm not sure I really want to bring along prosperity, to bring this level of ill-being, right? So it's been really key for me. After discovering everything he talks about, I then started looking back into my own country and seeing what the heck is going on over there, where are we at, trying to do a little bit of diagnosis, and from there, maybe where do we need to go from? Where do we need to go to? So remember when Michael talked about, I think you said John Telegato, he said school is 13 years of learning how to be passive and dependent. For our schools in Africa, add the colonialist background to it. The way our books are written, what we're supposed to learn about history, everything, it is like, the passivity and dependency that you're talking about, but on top of that, add some salt and pepper of, colonialism everywhere. And then you expect that one day, some of us Africans are gonna be able to stand proudly as head of one of our countries and be saying to the other camp, no, you can't. This is what we think is best for our nation. This is what we think is best for our people, and you butt off. We're gonna collaborate, or we're not gonna do anything. No more of this nonsense of neocolonialism. How do you expect a kid who all the way to 22 years old, for 22 years old at the minimum, has been told what to think, how to think, what to say, and to just be like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, because you guess what? You have the authority. There is this little 3 letters next to your name, or you have that white skin color on you, all of which provide you with this authority markers. And then 22 years later, this same kid is supposed to turn around and start to challenge things around him or herself as they should. I think that's total schizophrenia, and I think it's really, really unfair and ridiculous. It's never going to work, and we're seeing it right now. So it's been important for me. So then, since I understood what he's talking about, I don't have any children of my own, and I don't have skin in the game. You see, after me, it's over, isn't it? I don't have skin in the game, as most people who have children. But I happen to be one of those people that feels like I'm part of a human family, and so I have skin in the game, especially when it comes to African kids. So it was important for me then to start looking and seeing what's going on. So there, what we have is all of these elite schools where the elite kids go to, and they're pretty much starting to be brainwashed as, you know, what's going on over here. And then you have 99% of a young population, the children. And by the way, we happen to be one of the youngest nations in the world in terms of how old our population is. When others, you know, like a country like Japan, where now they have gotten to the place where they sell more adult diapers than they sell baby diapers, we have more young people below the age of 18 than in most other nations. So, but we got to do something with this youth. We have to. Because I certainly do not want one day for the robots to have more value than they do. Because guess what? If you don't you know, train and foster your human capital, you know, just like anything that you don't put to work, it's not going to realize its full potential. So I started being very freaked out when I looked at 99%, because I have a skincare company called Skin is Skin, and our lab is in this tiny village, you know, in the middle of nowhere, and we're 25,000 souls. It's a multiple little villages together with 25,000 souls, very rural. No one wants to go there, establish a lab that's supposed to make products that are going to be sold at Whole Foods, because that's our situation. But you can get it done. So 99% of children, and this is just my number, just to kind of show you how big this whole issue is. Maybe the number is not 99%, but I'm just trying to give you a scale. More of our young people are having an education that I don't think anybody in this room would call an education. Let me give you examples. How else would you have children that are 9 years old, 10 years old, and they still can't read. They still can't write their names. And they have been going to school, supposedly, since the age of 6, sometimes even before. What have these kids been doing in school? And in Senegal, you know, it's a country where most kids will speak Wolof, which is the indigenous language of Senegal. Nangadef Mangifirek, that's how it sounds. And so they come into these schools where all they get to learn, what the official language is French. My God. So home, you're speaking Wolof, that's all you know. Your parents don't understand a word of French. This is a country where French is the official language. But your parents don't understand a word of French because guess what? They're uneducated as well and all of that, and now you're here and you're with them. So they don't understand French, but at school, all they talk about is in French. You get beaten up if you try to speak in Wolof or try to even get something clarified in your own native language. You know, it's hard to learn that 2 + 2 = 4 in your own language, then go ahead and try that in a different language, especially in a language like French. That one is a tough one. So I'm just seeing our kids. I'm just like, yeah. I just got to the place where I'm like, we're freaking doomed. No, we are. Because what do I have? I have my kids who have you know, the ability to go into these fancy schools. We're training them to become French bureaucrats. And then a majority of them who are in these other schools where only God knows what they're doing over there. And I'm just like, what do we do with that? And then Michael, being as positive as he is, because me, I was just like, at some point I was just like, you know, this is too overwhelming. I was too crazy to go look in places where I should never have looked maybe in the first place. Because, you know, there's something nice about ignorance. You just live in bliss. If you don't know something is going on, you're just like happy as a cow. Hopefully they are happy. At least I only deal with happy cows. But so we did this little program, and now it's going to become a real school. And we've been at it for more than a year now, and this coming fall is going to become a real school, like I said. And all we have been doing is what he's talking about in terms of the Socratic method especially. We are seeing the kids gain such, you know, vocabulary in French, and guess what? They're also learning English at the same time. See, kids have such an ability. I was trilingual when I was 7. Kids done right can just do so much. I was shocked. I, who is so Afro-optimist, you see, I'm very hard on my own people because I love myself and my own people. So I'm hard on us because I expect the best from us. So I will not cut us any slack anytime ever. So I expect the best from our people. So, but even then, even I, who likes to tell the world that I really believe in all of this, I was brought to tears when we brought, because our schools in the middle of this village, we are connected. So our kids are using Khan Academy to do math at their own pace. They're using Duolingo to learn English, and then we kind of discuss. We have discussions in English with the teacher. And then the kids, I think by now, were you guys making fun of me that they probably type better on the computer than I do, because we have typing games for them, and we do Tetris, and some of these kids are just like flying off the charts. So how do you explain? I mean, the first time I brought the computers, these kids have never touched a computer before. And by the end of the day, he's my witness, navigating like they were with this thing forever. So it is pretty amazing what's going on, especially this method so Michael has been helping us create a curriculum that is uniquely ours. Because one of the first things I've always said is, I do believe that we have one of the such virtue cultures he talks about. It is true that our young people have a deep sense of meaning, deep. You see, children here, maybe you need to always entertain them with this and that, the screen, all of that. Our kids can't wait to come to school, and then they can't wait to go back home. And then, the other day I was so excited because I asked one of them, and he's 7 years old, barely, and I said, Magatte, his name is like me, they all call him my little namesake, and he looks like he's got a lot of my attributes. But anyway, he's a little boy. But they said, Magatte, so the other day I was on the phone, and I said, Magatte, what did you do this weekend? And he said, well, because they go to school also during the weekend. And he said, well, been to school, and I did this and I did that, and he was telling me all of these things. And he's like, and then I worked, and I did my work. I'm like, what do you mean your work? He's like, I went to help with, first of all, I made my room, and, he's talking to you about how he made his room, how he went to fetch something for his father. So these children really feel like a sense of, what? My work is not English only my 4th language, so it's not superfluous.
Superfluous.
Yeah, it's not. My work is not superfluous. This little boy knows that his family relies on him to make his bed. It's not just being nice or just doing something. It's real. Like his or her contribution makes a difference in the family. Of course, we want to get to a place where everybody, because these are very poor children, and we want to all get to a place where children, where it's not a matter of necessity. But still, I do think it is important to have a sense of meaning, to know that it doesn't matter how old you are, your presence on this earth matters. Matters. It's not just a game. So that's what I think we have. And also we have this wonderful reverence that our young people have for older people. Whether, when I say old, it's like you're 7 years old and you're looking up to the 70-year-old and you're like, I want to be this. See, I am so worried about this culture here. I think it's wonderful to celebrate young people and to celebrate youth. But when we get to a place where it's all about, let's put the youth to solve all of our problems, us, we've effed it up so much, we need to get out of the way. I'm like, what world do you live in? What do you give to wisdom? What? I mean, we live in a country now, you talk about polarization, you think it's only about politics? I see it happening also between old and young. I mean, now you turn 40 years old and you're starting to worry that nobody wants to listen to you anymore. And guess what, by the way? If you're lucky enough, I hope you all make it to 40, 50, 60, 70, and 90, and 100 years old. And what? They're going to put us into boats now and throw us in the water? Because, these old farts, they've messed everything up. I hear about everything, the climate, everything. It's like, you young person, take a seat and learn. And this is coming from a younger person too. I'm just so sick and tired of this. It's not even a joke. So this is also a part of a healthy culture we have, that I do not want to lose, this reverence that we have for older people, no matter what older means, because there's always somebody older than you. That's what I want to keep preserving. And also this sense of profound dignity and honor. What does it mean to be honorable? What does it mean to be dignified? We have lost it here, I think. I am obsessed. I am upset to no end when I visit schools, oftentimes. You walk into a room, feet are up a chair, and talking in a certain way. I mean, call me old school, I don't care. The truth is also, I know that these kids like a little bit of framing a little bit around them. So I do think that there are a lot of this stuff that I want to keep. And I am on a race. I am in a race for my life. Why? Because I want to make sure that our young people, we are at this very particular juncture right now, where my young people can go the US way through sheer copy-paste, or they can leapfrog and actually show the way forward to America and others, and bring back a little bit more sanity. And that's a path I want them to see. So by using his methodology that has been rooted, because that's what, I mean, you know, I said, Michael, these are my parameters. This is what I like about my culture and what our people respect also about our culture. We're not messing with that part. Everything else, are we just gonna make it better and really get into the 21st century? That's all I was asking for. And I feel like that's what we're trying to do in our own little way in this one village. And my whole thing is, let us get to the first cohort. If we get to the first cohort, then I think there's a lot we're gonna be able to share with the rest of the country and maybe with the rest of the continent, because this is very high value education that we're providing at a very low cost, very low cost. You know, we've assembled few things, you know, like between the tablets that we use, only a couple $100 a tablet, and then, you know, the teacher being trained in a certain way, and then this ability of kids teaching kids, we could really scale this thing up very much. So I am interested in seeing how we can keep the very best of our culture the way it is, obviously leapfrog into the modern world, and maybe create a new reality for people outside of Senegal. I think what we have is great, and I think a lot of the people outside of our nation could benefit from that. So to me, when he talks about, I would never have thought in a million years if you asked me about what is education, I would have said that. But to me, that is what true, real education is. Because you give them that, a sense of critical thinking, a sense of curiosity, they can learn anything going forward. And by the way, aren't we supposed to be lifelong learners? So isn't it true that maybe the most important thing and the only important thing to teach a human being is maybe this ability to learn? Let them figure out what's right or what's not right. It's up to them. They're human beings. They came to this earth with a mind. So that's what I see in what he's doing. And I have to say, you know, when I say this, oftentimes people laugh, but when you understand what I'm talking about, you don't laugh. And I think it's the people who are in the traditional sector who usually just like, huh, what she's talking about. But I like to say that education is in deep crisis everywhere around the world, whether it's France, the US, or anywhere, or even in my country for the reasons I talked about. I haven't seen the type of education I can stand behind almost anywhere except for his schools. And so I do hope that what he does is what wins. I do hope that one day we get to the place where, you know, the most valuable company in the world is not something making electronics, but something really, truly bringing well-being, health, and happiness to people, for real. And that's what I'm seeing here. And Michael has always been ahead of his time, and I do think that once again, he'll be right. Probably 10 years, 15 years from now, I envision a world in which we're gonna do more and more of his schools and more of what he's bringing to young people. So thank you.
So I'm gonna put a few, she's always a hard act to follow. So I'm gonna just close a few threads and then we'll open up to a Q&A. So specifically, one of the things we haven't talked a lot about is academic performance, but I wanna be very clear. One of the ways in which so I have students in our schools take the SAT from 9th grade on a voluntary basis 3 times a year. And the idea is if you take the SAT as a senior and you don't like your scores, then you have to get an expensive coach or cram or whatever, and it's a disaster. But if in 9th grade you know where you are and you know where you want to be, you've got 4 years. Not a big deal. And again, if you have some discipline, you've got 4 years, you can crank it up. And in particular, with respect to the Socratic, if we're reading difficult material on a daily basis, a lot of the SAT verbal is reading difficult passages and answering very nuanced questions on them. The average American senior reads material at a 7th grade level if they read recreationally at all. And most teens no longer read at all. I would say the best thing about my own education is I grew up in northern Minnesota with bad TV reception, so I read a lot. It actually turns out that if you look at global data, everybody's concerned about the US scoring poorly on international tests, but if you look only at American households with 1 or fewer television sets, those households rank near the top globally. The problem is about 75% of American households have more than 3 television sets, and this is decades old data, so now it's probably on the phone, on the mobile device. But basically, our kids are more addicted to electronics than probably any other kids on earth. But if you read a lot, you crank up the score. So our kids gain about double the national average on SAT verbal, and we're reading, thinking, talking serious material every day. Very different thing, but I also see this as creating a culture and a subculture. Hungarian mathematics is renowned for, in the 20th century, the most amazing mathematicians were Hungarian. It turns out there was kind of a culture of math competition in late 19th, early 20th century Hungary, where it was normal among lots of schools for kids to be just really engaged in these math competitions. And I see that kind of subculture of math competitions is what made Hungarian mathematics absolutely amazing. One more other data point on the subculture thing. Judith Rich Harris was a wonderful social scientist who pointed out that peers are more powerful than parents or educators even. So the best predictor of whether or not a peer will smoke is whether or not the other teens that he or she hangs out with smoke. The best predictor of whether or not they do drugs is whether the other teens do. What language do the teens? If parents speak a different language, the teen typically speaks the parents of the peers. We evolved to be, the peers are who matters. That's where all the sex and status games matter. We old folks, we just don't matter anymore. So whether we're parents or teachers, there's a point at which peer influence is way more important. So if we can create peer cultures that provide these virtues, then that's the big win intellectually in terms of test scores, but also in terms of health and well-being. Finally, one other loop on the Senegal piece. The Murid culture, which is the dominant kind of Sufi clan in Senegal, is incredibly entrepreneurial. Magatte can go up to a random person on the street in New York, Paris, Milan. Most of the black people selling stuff on the street are Senegalese Murid. She'll start talking and Wolof with them right away. And there have been a number.
And the truth is, I can go anywhere in the world if I get stranded. And the funny thing is, we're not that many, but we're everywhere. I bet you if I go somewhere in the North Pole, there's probably going to be one Senegalese walking around and probably doing something. And I can always go up to any of them, even if I'm in distress or whatever, and I will always find somebody providing me with everything that I need. So there's a huge sense of support among ourselves.
But this entrepreneurial diaspora is primarily uneducated. It's going back to the Senegalese education system, training passivity and dependence. Again, with all due respect to French bureaucrats, you have this incredible global entrepreneurial diaspora of uneducated Senegalese, but then the educated Senegalese all want a good job in government. And so if we could flip that around and have all those Senegalese creating the prosperity, total game changer in Senegal. And with that, we'll open up to Q&A.
But we want to do it in a way that works for them.
We need to make a switch of microphones so that people who are asking questions can be heard. So you have like 2 minutes to quickly grab something if you want to grab.
And we're supposed to do that.
While we switch the microphones.
Yeah, and we're supposed to go over there.
So that.
Yeah, so you guys will just answer questions from.
Okay. Do you want that?
No.
Testing, yeah.
Food, glorious food. I'm fine with water. Fine, thank you.
So to keep things moving, we'll open up the floor for questions. Mason Hunt on the other side of the speakers has a mic, and I do, and we will give the mic to students first. If there's students here, we'll give preference to students. Yeah. Nice try, Scott. You'll get a question at some point if you wish. Any students want to start by asking a question?
Yeah. I just want to say I commend you for actually being one of the first speakers in a while to actually propose a solution, but I was actually interested in kind of the other end, which is kind of what led to the current devolution of a culture of virtue. I was wondering if you've done any kind of like historical research on that matter.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. Does this works? Okay. Don't have to be too close. So a couple of things. One is just actually going way back. If you're really interested, the notion of paideia as the discussion of virtue kind of coming out of classical Greece was a dominant understanding of what an education was for about 800 years, from about 500 BC to about 300 AD. So there was a long stretch when, much longer than US, when that was kind of a normal understanding of education. And then, fall of Rome and all that, coming back out of the Renaissance. And then it gets complicated. So on the philosophical side, virtue ethics we've seen a revival of virtue ethics in the last 50 years maybe. But, between utilitarianism and deontology, outside of religious traditions, so religious traditions preserved a virtue culture, and I would say ethnic traditions preserved one. But the educated class began to think of ethical issues outside of a virtue framework. One of the reasons I like Alistair McIntyre is it's almost the sociology of virtue. And it's considered a work of philosophy, but I think as philosophy became more kind of abstract, it was disconnected. A much more significant strand was the introduction of Prussian-style schooling. And Horace Mann brought that kind of top-down, state-controlled schooling where prior to that, when Thomas Jefferson was an enthusiast for an educated populace, one of his tutors was a Scottish person. Scotland there's a wonderful book called something like How Scotland Created the Modern World. And despite the hype headline, it's amazing. But Scottish was one of the first literate cultures because of Protestantism. And so there were, at every church school, kids learned to read. And so coming out of that, Jefferson thought, this is a wonderful thing. We should have everybody be literate. And I think that is a great vision. But that sort of vision of small community schools, sometimes people think of Jefferson as advocating public school. In effect, he wanted every community to have a school where parents would pay tuition, but the community would subsidize it for kids who couldn't afford it. So in really many ways, he was basically a purely private system with community support, what we might call, vouchers, something like that. But it was later with Horace Mann when he brought this Prussian system where the state actually trained the teachers. And so for me, implicit in what I'm saying is to have a virtue culture, I want to be able to train all my teachers. Montessori has their own teacher training, teacher accreditation. Actually, a very different example I didn't get into are martial arts. And if any of you have done martial arts, every martial artist say that they come from the best lineage and all the other lineages are garbage. But what I like about that system is there's a distinctive path of excellence in each one. And, you can imagine if we had, again, I'm going to bash the academic researchers, but if we had academic scholars doing, let's determine what the best, kung fu is, I think we'd destroy, kung fu in a generation. So what we need are individuals pursuing their own sense of quality and not, academia is great at doing research. It's not great at cultivating practices of excellence. That's why I love the lineage tradition of martial arts or the traditional virtue cultures where you have people who instantiate certain kinds of excellence, passing it on. I think as long as the traditional culture was healthy in the 19th century, in early 20th century, the government schools did not do a lot of damage. But as we became a more secular society and as social norms began collapsing, it became worse. And again, focusing on adolescence, the term teenager and adolescence were both created in the early 20th century. Before that, we didn't have a concept. Kids worked. I grew up on a farm. You just work. There's no such thing as a teenager. It was in the 1930s for the first time when a majority of American high school students, American teens, went to high school. So prior to that, high school was rare. And so I think it's not an accident that by the time we get into the 50s, after World War II, we see Rebel Without a Cause and the notion of teenagers as disrespectful and angry and alienated. I think the whole rise of, I would say, toxic teen culture dates from the period after when a majority of students began attending high school in the 30s. So I think there's kind of a long sort of, the erosion of other sorts of virtue that kept things going well for a period of time, and then this gradual period when all of a sudden we had only government-managed schools dominating the existence of teens. And that's, again, I think it's not an accident. It's from the 50s when the suicide rates began skyrocketing. You're welcome.
Non-students can now join the discussion.
This question is going to sound very pessimistic, maybe. Okay, so right now, we developed education in America in the 1930s so that we could provide factory workers, by and large, right? So my question is, where do you see the economy going? Because what happens is, so my background, I lived in Korea for 7 years. And what happened was that the more people that went to college, the fewer people wanted to do the triple D jobs, dirty, disgusting, dangerous, right? So right now in America, we have only 5-6% unemployment. And my question is, if we create these virtue cultures and then we kind of shift our society, who's going to do all the work that we have now? Because we are prosperous as a nation. So where do you see the economy going in the future to provide jobs for all these people, plus the jobs that we need done as a culture?
No, so a couple of things. First, I love Mike Rowe and that whole thing, and I would say there's certainly a virtue culture thing going on there. But separately from that, I'm a big fan of Dan Pink, who wrote a book called A Whole New Mind, and he made the case that in the 21st century, we need people who will be creative and empathetic and immersed in the world of meaning because of Asia, automation, and abundance. He makes the case that cheap products from Asia, it'll be hard to compete with low-cost products. Beyond that, automation, robots taking the jobs, and then abundance. The abundance thing is interesting because he makes the case that because we've got so much, we're going to care more about meaning and beauty and elegance and that sort of thing. And so I actually see all sorts of niche and boutique opportunities. I'll give you a really kind of silly example, but I think there are lots of them. I know a guy who is a carpenter, and he was getting into the business when, after 2008, people couldn't afford houses for a while. He was getting into the business of creating handcrafted doors, hand-carved doors. And you may not be able to buy a new house, but maybe you can upgrade from, a super crappy door to a, $2,000, $3,000 hand-carved door, maybe a $5,000 one. Different thing, actually Dan Pink uses the example of designer toilet bowl brushes. Now at Target or Walmart, you can get designer toilet bowl brushes. Everything was going to be designed. The whole eco-resort things, people are creating new and nifty resorts around the world. I think quality, so I think where these things will go is, while there will be dirty jobs, the robots will do more and more of those, we want higher quality experience. So I'm a big believer in the experience economy. Why is it that life is in any way is not pleasant? What entrepreneurs, my favorite definition of an entrepreneur is somebody who thinks about what sucks and how to fix it. And so an example I like to give is, I'm old enough to remember alarm clocks just being bzz, 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 and then you get the radio alarm where you get to wake up to your favorite radio station, and then you get all sorts of custom music options. Now you can get alarm clocks that make light gradually make your room light, or smells so your room gradually smells nicer. You can get an alarm clock that makes coffee by your bedside, or an alarm clock that cooks bacon by your bedside. If you have a hard time waking up because of the alarm clock, you can get an alarm clock that is a little robot that runs away, and you have to get out of bed and chase it around the room. So, people think, oh, what are people going to do in the future? Is life perfect? A different example, there were buses for a while in San Francisco that were like, kind of a Starbucks, a nice cool coffee shop. So instead of the bus experience being what it is, they were these really cool boutique things. You just had a good time. Of course, regulation killed that bus route. But if we if we have the opportunity to create higher quality, lower cost, and cooler experiences, we will continue to do so. And we need lots of people to create cooler, higher quality experiences. Why does a dentist's office suck? The dentist's office should be a fun time. I'm kind of going over the top. But think about any part of your life that is not wonderful. Why? And mostly I blame the regulatory state. But let's find ways to make it endlessly better. And as we make it endlessly better, for me, school, I want my kids to enjoy school all day. Sometimes it's hard. Maybe I have to really think hard for a while. But on balance, I want to create an economy where we are all entrepreneurs of happiness and well-being, and then we can develop niche abilities to endlessly refine that. So this is kind of big picture answer. You want to pipe in?
Yeah, and I think also, challenge yourself in a way, because living in this place, but I spend half my time here and half in Africa still, and I think people here have no idea what can be coming next. I'm one of those people for one who cannot wait for the robots to come, because anything that's automated, really, us human beings have better things to do than doing this minion work. When we had to, fine, we did it. But I think time has come for us to transcend, and time has come for us to truly, truly exercise our humanity. I'll give you some examples, and I think we're gonna see so many human jobs that no robot can take, because us humans need that human touch and that human connection. I give you one example. Maybe the way we're gonna treat death, and that, my first husband passed away when I was not even 30 years old yet. And, my family, they repatriated me right away back to Africa. And the way they dealt with me and with my grief had nothing to do with what people here wanted me to do. And yet they supposedly have the best medication, the best antidepressants they could put me on, the best supposedly, therapists they could put me on, all of that stuff. I was going to use another word, but let's have respect. All of that stuff and those people and all of the expertise, and I'm sure maybe they help here and there, let's be a pluralist. But back home, what they did is spend time with me, and I spent time with whom? I spent time with my elders, because you know what? And they told me, the first thing they said, once again, this is happening again. We send you guys over there, and then one of the first rules of life you forget is that death is part of life. And the fact that you're even sitting here and grieving the way you're grieving is so upside down. And so just kind of for them to bring back this type of wisdom and feed me with food that was grown, in the little, so I could imagine places where people now, in the future, where it's all high human touch, where you lost a loved one, and for just a month like I did, you need to go away. You need to go away from it all, and you need to be with people who really understand how you feel, who have wisdom to offer, and their words are so comforting. It is so warm, and somehow it's true, and they have this different vision of life, and they walk you through all of this. They feed you, they know to leave you alone when you need to be left alone, on all of that stuff. I imagine a place like that, for example, and many more. This is about death, but it could be, bless you, could be about some other stuff. So us humans have only began to scratch the surface of what it is to be human, to ourselves and to others. And that, I'm hoping that this space that's going to be freed by the robot showing up, and hopefully if in the meantime we do what he does in these schools, then everybody is more or less ready to go. And then maybe there's a whole new world in front of us where we're finally going to feel like what it is to be human. And that's what I'm excited about. And I'm not scared. I, for one, am not scared. Because I believe one thing, it's the resilience of a human being. We will adapt. We will. So that's what I see ahead of us. Crazy stuff that humans do for each other that we would never have thought possible before. And a lot of us will be willing and ready to pay a lot of money for it, because you know what? It makes a difference.
So I myself am a recovering public high school teacher, as I like to say. And part of what I guess pushed me away is that I taught entrepreneurship, and I found very quickly that the school system, both the structure and the culture there, was actually quite hostile to entrepreneurship in general, to both as an approach to life, but also to the actual individuals, the people who I would try to show my students as successful examples of entrepreneurship were viewed as bad people by the vast majority of the rest of the staff and the faculty. So my question for you is, add one more thing onto that, is I found very quickly I can't teach kids to value entrepreneurship or to think like an entrepreneur in an environment that is hostile to those ideas. And so when their teachers themselves can't be entrepreneurial in their classroom, when the school system is antithetical to entrepreneurship, they don't see that as any kind of ambition whatsoever. So now my question then to you is, how do you train your teachers both to be entrepreneurial in their instruction, but then also to allow the students to be entrepreneurial in their thinking, which you and I both know often means causing problems.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work within your school
No,
structure?
that's a great question. So one piece right away is almost in every case, I want a teacher who's been in the real world and ideally has done something entrepreneurial in the real world. And there are a lot of people. Sometimes there are entrepreneurs who are mid-career professionals coming back into teaching, or there are people that have spent a few years, doing an entrepreneurial project that failed, and they go back because school has steady employment. But I would say that's one of the most important criteria, is that they've done something in the real world, ideally something entrepreneurial. Because if they've never had that experience, I actually think a huge problem with our education system is most people go to K-12, they go to university, then they go back into the classroom, and they've never spent time out there actually doing it. So for me, that's a sine qua non. But beyond that, I'm very interested in different ways. I see both Socratic and entrepreneurials. We want to, have kids, it coming out of kids going out rather than pounding back in. And so part of the structure of schools is, even the lesson plan. The lesson plan is one of the most basic units, but a lesson plan basically says, I'm going to tell you. And that's different from either you're going to think for yourself or you're going to come up with a project. So part of this is a coaching model where I train the teachers. Your job is to coach them to be amazing. I think of every student has a different kind of genius. Our job as parents and educators is to find that kid's genius and crank it up. And so let's figure out what kinds of projects, and it's an art. Coaching students is an art. They say coaching, so you take them where they are. Most kids are not ready to do a serious project on day one, entrepreneurially wise, but you kind of scaffold up, but the goal is always to kind of reach escape velocity. So part of this is why I want to train teachers. We get teachers who are already some entrepreneurial experience, and then kind of free them from traditional, got to cover this lesson plan today, and then train them to coach students to escape velocity. And one of the other things we do just structurally is we have communities of practice where we have teachers who are engaged in these practices talking every week. One of the other things we do is our school is Monday through Thursday with Friday for entrepreneurial projects and internships and special classes, which means our staff can get together on Fridays and figure out how do we become better at coaching entrepreneurial projects or better at Socratic or whatever. But great question.
Hi. So is your solution and vision kind of have a market of schools where maybe religious institutions are creating schools because they already have their own ingrained culture, values, and such?
Certainly, that's part of it. Certainly, I think in a lot of communities, the religious schools are going to be some of the most effective ones. So, again, I think I see a market where lots of different people are competing in lots of different ways, but I think there are lots of places where the religious schools, in some ways, it's tricky. I was going to say, in some ways, religious communities have the best, healthiest culture of virtues. Again, the Mormons are just totally rocking it. A different case, though, I had consulted for a Catholic school in Pennsylvania, and I was saying we have an obligation to explain to our kids, that there is a right and wrong. What is right and wrong? What was interesting about this is the older nuns were saying yes, but most of the younger teachers had been taught in schools of education at a Catholic school, and they said, well, maybe we shouldn't tell kids what's right and wrong. And I'll give you. So I am concerned with kind of relativism. I remember there was a situation. I created one school where parents bought their 4th grade daughter a porn star lunchbox. And I'm like, you guys are out to lunch. What are you thinking? And these are educated parents. Another case where an educated parent was a PhD and the daughter said F you to the teacher and we suspended her, but the parent said, look, it's in the dictionary. And a PhD parent, parents are out to lunch like you wouldn't believe. And so that's why, we need to have some kind of where everybody's on board, like, okay, these are the boundaries and we agree on these boundaries. Again, different communities can have different boundaries, but I think in many cases the churches are going to be the healthiest kind of centers for kind of virtue cultures. And some will fail, some not. That happens, but over time, I think we could see some really great church schools coming out.
My name is Krzysztof Moszyński. I'm from Poland, and I thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. I delve on issues of education for years now, and there are two aspects as far as I can understand them. There is an aspect of what to teach, which most people tend to focus on, both in Poland and probably in the US. But there is also an aspect of how to teach. And there are many aspects to this aspect. Because there are structural aspects, there are aspects of teaching techniques, and I won't ask you about them because we would have to be here for hours probably to talk about this. But I'll ask you about two models that I've heard about. There is the model of homeschooling and the model of democratic schools, so-called democratic schools. Have you heard about the second model? Have you heard about those models? What do you think about those models?
That's a great question. So first of all, some people have described our program as homeschooling by professionals. Insofar as homeschoolers have the opportunity to really personalize, we personalize to a great extent. The way I look at it is, for me, it's always about what's best for the child and not what the curriculum says. And so, for instance, if I have a student who's a brilliant film editor or a designer, and he or she doesn't want to do a third year of math, I'm totally okay. You can be a world-class filmmaker or designer without having, Algebra 2. Totally cool with me. And homeschoolers have that kind of flexibility. So certainly homeschool, unschooling community, I'm very friendly to them. There is, at the high school level, it's nice to have a community, which is harder when they're secondary, and it's maybe hard to teach AP Physics and AP Chem and so forth in a homeschool setting. So very sympathetic. The democratic schooling, so Sudbury is one model, but in many cases they do give kids radical freedom. But I would say one of the things I not necessarily, or my difference with them, two differences. Sometimes they want the kids necessarily to govern things, and I'm totally happy with that as an experiment. I personally don't want the kids to govern everything. Second, separate from that though, they don't focus enough on the culture. So I would say I've seen really great Sudbury schools, but very often, if you have a powerful personality, that powerful personality creates a culture there. And so I think when those things work really well, it's because there's a powerful personality. Actually, going back to the unschooling example, one case, Laura Deming is one of the most incredible young women ever. She was working with she was unschooled by her father. She was working at a lab at UCSF at the age of 12. She went to MIT at the age of 14. At 16, she dropped out to get a Teal Fellowship, $100,000 a year for 2 years. Now at 23, she's a leading anti-aging VC in Silicon Valley. So absolute rock star. And her dad said, well, I just let her do whatever I want. And I got talking to her dad, who's now a friend, and he's really intellectual. He's asking Socratic questions of her all the time. He had her exposed to lots of good stuff. He actually had her do Saxon math. And so his initial thought, I unschooled her. I let her do whatever I want. And then it turns out he's this incredible entrepreneurial intellectual, and she absorbed it, So I would say I want the successful unschoolers and democratic schoolers to pay a lot more attention to the kind of implicit culture. And I think then we'll see more of those freedom-based models work when you're attentive to the culture. Because conversely, I've seen unschoolers play video games for 6 years or whatever. Not too cool in my view.
Thank you. So you're talking about selling and marketing happiness and well-being. Broadly speaking, how do you think American culture defines happiness and well-being, especially in light of the current higher education scandal?
Well, good question. I think, so one way that I think of, I think that people crave happiness and well-being, and I think people with who are insecure, I'm a believer in Maslow's hierarchy, that if people don't have their status and ego needs met, then they do all sorts of stupid things for ego and status. And so, I feel sorry for those people whose ego needs were so pathetic that they needed to do this. For me, boy, poor person. Well, so I would say I'm, again, as Magatte will tell you, I'm endlessly optimistic. So when you say our values, there are some pathetic people out there. And I know lots of good people. I know lots of people who really care about the right thing. And even with the students in my school, I would say one thing about talking about what's good and valuable day in, day out, is gradually they realize that short-term satisfactions do not lead to long-term happiness. I think if you put people in communities where you focus on, will I be happier if I get this short-term thing or if I focus on the long-term, almost everybody will come to the long-term. So, middle schoolers are, middle school is a tough age. I see much of our society is based of a bunch of middle schoolers that never grew up. And so you've got all these poor middle schoolers who didn't get their ego needs satisfied, and they're out doing all sorts of silly, ridiculous, pathetic things. Meanwhile, we can take the healthier people, create communities where they focus on how long-term happiness and well-being is better than short-term. So yeah, it's terrible out there, and there are lots of beautiful pockets of wonderful human beings. And I want to kind of aggregate the good and make the tiny pockets of good bigger, stronger, better, till the good rules and the bad is this tiny corner thing.
I love your notion of the pluralism of the different value cultures out there. I'm curious as to, because you also mentioned the idea of the intellectual virtues, and so where do things fall when the intellectual virtues butt up against those different value cultures, different aspects of those?
I mean, I think some of these are simply hard questions. So one of the great things about a market is, suppose we were to decide what is the right kind of food we should be eating. And there were, one kind of government food service, and we all had to vote on the right kind of government food service. Would it be more like a high school cafeteria, or would it be more like a 7-Eleven, or would it be more like a Whole Foods, or would it be more like a gourmet restaurant? Probably more like a high school cafeteria. But part of this is, you can mix and match. And so one of the reasons I went in this direction, I love the fact that Magatte is so passionate about mine. When I was younger, I thought, I'm doing it the right way. Everybody needs to do it my way. I wanted to be dictator and force everybody to do it my way. And I thought, there's no way I could possibly meet the needs of everybody. And even, what's the right way to approach sexuality? I don't think there is one right way. What's the right way to approach, spiritual beliefs? I don't think there is one right way. What's the right way to approach, even interpersonal interactions? I don't think there is one right way. There are people who have more aggressive style, people that have a much more peaceful style. This is where at this point I am a radical pluralist. There will be different communities. Even within Montessori, these communities splinter off. It's like with the PC people think the Macintosh people are terrible. There will be endless schisms, but endless schisms are okay, because gradually some of those schisms will result in healthier and better models. And that's where I'm a really radical, let the market decide. If we structure, I'll add one other piece. So ultimately, I would like to see schools that develop good habits, their graduates have lower cost insurance. So suppose, for instance, you had some graduates of your schools that almost never indulged in drugs and sex and rock and roll or whatever, and or they do a healthy version of drugs and sex and rock and roll. I'm not moralistic, but if we could have people, tiny percentage of healthcare costs are due to a small percentage of the population, just sugar. If you eat less sugar and you're healthier and you're less likely to have this, whatever it is, I want to see a market where we are validating the educators who produce great long-term results. And I want to create the kind of institutional infrastructure, including insurance pricing, such that we have long-term valid measures of how well we're educating our young people. So that's a pretty abstract answer, but I've thought about this a lot. So.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask about play, particularly unstructured, unsupervised play, and what role that plays, pardon the pun, in your vision of education, your vision of adolescence, your vision of your diagnosis of a lot of the problems like anxiety and so on. What role does the loss of unstructured and unsupervised play?
So I certainly am a big fan of play and love play. I think, personally in my own life, I'm kind of a believer in my version of the 80-20 rule, which is I get about 80% of my work done in 20% of the time. And so actually, more concretely, I find when you're in peak performance mode, again, Cal Newport is great. Cal Newport shows that world-class performers actually practice less than mediocre performers. But part of this is how do you optimize your ability to perform well, and how do you optimize? I'm very interested in learning how to learn. So. One of the things I've become a really effective learner how to learn. So I'll give you an outrageous brag. I took I've never been trained as a teacher, but I've taken various alternative education tests. So in Alaska, I'd never had a course in pedagogy. I read a book on pedagogy the night before, and I scored the highest in the state of Alaska on the pedagogy exam. But part of this is you get really good at learning how to learn. If you're motivated and you care and you're passionate, you get shit done. And I think a lot of school is this incredibly boring. School teaches you not to be effective. School teaches you, again, to be passive. So, going back to play, I'd rather work hard, play hard. Part of it is ultimately, if you want to have, if you want to make money in life, you need to nail the work hard part. So all play is not good. But this is where, again, great educators, do I have the right balance between play and work? Do you have the right balance? Different markets, different kids. That's where certainly I think physical activity, unstructured play is important. And how do you blend that in with, say, creative play and intellectual play and entrepreneurial play? Lots of fun in terms of school design. So I want all of you guys to go out and just go crazy with school designs. Fantasize about whatever your thing is, how I could create the coolest, wildest school if there were no boundaries.
But I think it goes back to this notion of how do you call it? This notion of individualizing things. Like I look in our school, around the room, especially when we do Socratic, we know that each kid responds to different situations differently. Some of them are more like outspoken, and you can't really, how do I say that? Like what do you think would what motivates that child right next to the other child is absolutely not the same. Yet they're in the same classroom, and the teacher gets to know who responds to what, who needs more, like unstructured play, structured play, when, what, how. So this idea that we're putting our kid into these factories where they're supposedly being trained at something, I don't know what, but it's just, that's a fundamental premise that's so wrong to get started with. So I try to, what Michael has taught me is this idea of going back and treating each child as the different and unique human being that they are, even if they all happen to be in the same classroom. And I think it sounds hard to do like this, but this is where, again, we're going to be calling up on humans to do that work. A robot cannot do that. I don't care how well and the algorithm is behind that, thing. It can't. You need these subtleties, all that stuff that only another human being can get. And so for me, this is what, it is exciting, but also that's why I get worried about so many other kids out there. Are we going to be able to provide them with that?
Thank you both for a really absorbing talk this evening. I'm interested to probe your vision of the ideal school system a little bit further, Michael. You've talked about the virtues of markets and the importance of parents and students presumably also being able to choose what works for them. But one of the things that markets require is good information so that people can make informed decisions. So what, to your mind, are the most useful or important metrics or indicators of a quality school?
So one of the comparisons I made, actually almost 20 years ago, I wrote an article on this, is why do we have better information on sports cars than we do on schools? School is basically a $100,000 product. A sports car, $100,000 easily. And yet, car and driver, you get all these really great, road tests and, different, characteristics, and this is how it turns and this is how it brakes. Restaurant, gourmet menus or wines. So what I would love to see actually in terms of information, and I think if we had a full market, we'd do it. I'd love to see, and that's great, Waldorf and, democratic schools and Montessori, and I'd love to see, and those are like super beta versions, I'd love to see professional writers providing really nuanced reviews of all sorts of different characteristics, just like we do with cars and restaurants and wines. Anytime we have a market, we get information sources that provide us with amazing, it's fun. I love reading this stuff. I love people who are specialists in kind of the aesthetics of different sorts of things. So I'd love to see writers, Great Hearts this and Montessori that, and and as the information become more sophisticated, the product would become more sophisticated as well. Because if you're a world-class chef and you know that Michelin is coming, you're going to up your game. And I think right now, we're going to opt for a U.S. News and World Report or test scores or whatever. Banal, stupid, boring. I want so that's kind of my big picture vision, and I can't wait to get there.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
All right. I too am a recovering public school teacher. Although now I've been working at a charter school. We do focus on more Socratic method ideas. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, what do you think of sort of schools moving more and more online? Like I do see a lot of potential with online schools, and even when you do like sort of maybe you can do a virtual seminar even too. Like if you do like a virtual classroom. Do you have any thoughts on the future of like online schooling or using more and more technology based schools?
Sure. So a couple things. One is, at a high level, I think that as we have a flexible market, we'll see the human side and the technology side optimized in different ways. So it's some things that technology does really well, and we do use Khan Academy. We use Khan Academy in Senegal and at ATI. But part of that is we want to train the students to use it more effectively. So for me, it's not about the Khan videos. It's about the fact that we can have 30 students in one room all at different places in the curriculum, and Khan can track that. But I think one of the reasons online education has not had the promise that many people thought it would is it takes a human culture for most people. Most Coursera and whatnot, tiny percentage of students finish. But I think that's because they don't have a culture around how to work through it. So one of the things Magatte talked about in Senegal, students teaching students, this is based on the Lancaster schools in early 19th century England, where we're looking at ways, and we do this in our schools in San Francisco, where students in one point in Khan Academy help another student, and there's also a whole dynamic of how do you learn how to learn math. And so I'm looking at creating human subcultures where we become better at learning how to learn, better at learning technology, better at teaching people, better at learning how to focus. And then I see technology having all of the explosive impact it was expected to, but the technologists didn't realize that most students are just not prepared for the technology alone to do it. And finally, in the interactive things, we are doing an AT online, which includes online Socratics. So that kind of human-to-human enabled by technology, totally there, love it, doing it already. But a longer one, I can imagine technologists working with humans to kind of optimize both systems so that what technology does best, it does. What we humans do best, we do best.
Thank you for being here this evening, and I know that there are many more questions, and we could go on for quite a while. I'd like to remind you, that was the next thing I was going to say. I'd like to remind you that we are going to gather not in this room, but in this same building, Pima 230, so on this floor, just down the hall a little bit. If you wish to join us for Magatte speaking on how economic freedom and entrepreneurship can transform Africa. She's given us hints of that here to this evening, and we look forward to hearing her more. Thank you all for being here, and certainly I suspect the conversation is going to continue a little bit, and thank you very much. Thank them.